afternoon. This is Blake Hull with Knowledge Infusion, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Today's Infusion experts, Jason Averbook and Marisa Santisi, will talk deploying human capital management technology in 2011 and beyond. A few things before we get started. First, today's program is presented via integrated computer-based audio. If you experience any issues with audio, please just come to the screen and I'll assist you. The backup number is also posted here on the screen. I'm going to jot this number down in case you do experience any issues with your audio. One of the most common questions we get is, can we get a copy of today's slides? And the answer is, of course. All the attendees on the line will receive an email with instructions on both download the slides as well as a replay after today's presentation. I also encourage you to take a minute after today's presentation to fill out the post-event survey to let us know how we did. Always, we want today's event to be very interactive, so please post any comments or questions that you have at any time in either the chat panel or the Q&A panel located on your screen. Of course, we'll be monitoring the Q&A panel throughout today's presentation and saving time at the end for questions as well. And you can follow our tweet stream to Twitter at #KIDeploy. I would like to introduce today's presenters. Slide, please. I have Jason Averbook, Knowledge Infusion CEO, on the line. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hey, Blake, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can. Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great.
And I have Marisa Santisi, Director of KI Deployment Services, on the line. Marisa, are you there?
I'm here. Hello, Blake.
Okay. Hello. Great. Thank you guys both so much for joining us. And with no further ado, Jason, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Blake. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining. And Marisa, hi, how are you?
Good. You?
Great. Thank you. Marisa joining from D.C. today. I'm joining from Denver, Colorado. So really excited for, that so many people have shown interest and joined the event today. And once again, as Blake said, please use the Q&A box frequently. We want to make sure that you're asking a lot of questions and interacting with us as much as possible, even if it's you sound too loud, you sound too soft, I love her, whatever you want to say. Please feel free to type it in. Real quickly, Knowledge Infusion, not very quickly, organization that's really been tied to the whole human capital management space from strategy side, helping organizations develop their strategy, helping organizations understand what it takes to be successful in truly driving business outcomes. Our organization has over 365 customers globally and really focused on driving change, not around how do we necessarily think old school about HR and HR technology, but truly how do we make change and how do we drive change and how we do things going forward. When you look at the services we offer, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in detail today is truly this whole approach is, if you look at AI services, on the far left here you see our strategy services, helping organizations develop talent management and HR strategies, HR technology strategies, how do we deliver services, and then one of our services, vendor recommendation, really helping organizations making recommendations directly to them, eliminating the long old RFP processes and selection processes, making recommendations to them as to which vendor makes the most sense for them to use going forward. The second area that you see on the slide here, which are our deployment services, which we're going to talk about today, which is how do you take the strategy that we've built, you've built, and then apply that to deployment. We're going to be very in detail about this later on, but one of the things that we hear most frequently is the strategy we've built is not what happens once the technology is deployed. How do we ensure that linkage and that linkage is there? And lastly, what's our long-term insurance policy to make sure that we continue to grow and adapt and use more of the software? And that's where our KA on-demand services, our subscription services, come into play. So when you look at our breadth of services, it's everything from developing strategy to the deployment and implementation of the technology and those strategies, all the way through making sure that you're continuing to advance and grow over time. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about deployment services, and like I said, very pleased to have Marisa Santisi, our Director of Deployment Services, on the line with me. And as we talk through these things, we're going to explore a number of different areas that I really think will resonate with you. A lot of this ties back to a lot of your direct interactions and emails with us as an organization over the years as well. So where why HR technology and talent management deployments fail. What an outcome-based deployment, and why is that the direction that really guarantees success? What is success going forward? How important and what are these new era of processes that are required? What capabilities are needed in your organization? Think about what the audience is today, and then how do I build a budget for this and make sure that I market and message to those? So a lot to get through. Fasten your seatbelts. Once again, as usual, but hopefully take little tidbits. There, and at any time, happy to have further discussion. So just to make sure that everyone's listening, in Q&A, type in whether this sounds good, bad, and other things that you want to make sure that we cover. And hundreds of people on the line, I expect at least fee to say whether it's good, bad, or not. See, Blaine told you I could get them to talk at least a little bit. So let's start with this sort of HR success. What is the key to success? My HR and talent management deployments, they continue to fail, and really what we see as the differentiator in good deployments versus deployments that don't meet the outcomes. And one of the things we like to start with is truly in the marketplace today, HR has great technology. The technology that's being offered by vendors today is truly state-of-the-art. You look at those out there, they are offering great technology. What's happening, unfortunately, oftentimes is that the implementations are very old school. That graphic is meant to depict an old school, telephone. Everyone remember rotary dial phones, et cetera, et cetera. So we're using new technology, but we're doing implementations in the same way we've done them in the past. That can break any good technology, is if you do implementations the way you've done them in the past. So what we want to talk about today is truly what's the difference between an implementation and a deployment, and a deployment at a high level, which includes implementation, of course, is what's necessary to truly drive success. When we look at this, we see HR is facing this sort of twofold problem. HR software has evolved. Great. And all right, HR implementations and the evolving. Let's look at that. We look at the left, the audience. Audience has changed. The design has changed. Purpose has changed. The role IT has changed. On the right-hand side, what we is the outcome change. Your experience, focus may have changed. Holistic versus siloed approach around implementations has to change. And how we do change management has changed. Deployments today in 2011 and beyond are facing this twofold problem that we have to deal with. Everything has changed about HR software to actually drive value and quote-unquote meet the expectations. And someone really typed in a really cool thing in the chat window a second ago. In order to meet the expectations and needs, quote-unquote, implementations must evolve and turn into deployments. So look at the reasons why organizations have failed in these areas. Let's talk about those really quickly. First of all, look at executive support. We need executive support. What sometimes happens in our projects, see that the executives are very involved in the strategy. When it comes to deployment, it gets turned over to someone else. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. Our part is to make sure that executives stay involved and realize why they need to. Governance. Governance is not a task list. Governance is how do we make decisions and how do we make sure our decisions are known and are clearly communicated. Technology deployments fail and they're seen as IT projects. Technology deployments fail when the focus is on technology first. When the focus is on technology first, that crashes technology. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. Tends fail when we focus on projects, not programs. Thinking about the implementation of the software, and I assign a project manager versus assigning a program manager, meaning how are all these things going to fit together. When people think change management equals training, or management is the last thing you do. When I think about digitizing existing processes instead of thinking about processes differently, and when I think about forgetting outcomes and not truly driving what is going to quote-unquote meet expectations and needs, back to the great point that was made in the Q&A box. Marisa, before we jump into the outcome-based deployment and talk about that, maybe you can talk real quickly about your experience and other things that you want to add about these, why these deployments continue to fail and not meet the needs even when there's great technology out there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. So one interesting quote that's out there that I thought about sharing here was 75% of CEOs say deployments are doomed before they even started. So just that alone says quite a bit about executive support. Remember that as you plan for your projects, that you have the right support in the organization, and not just at the C-level, but all levels of the organization. That is one of the key drivers of success. A very specific example that I wanted to give is around forgetting outcomes. So I think most people in this call can probably relate to putting together a deployment plan and thinking about reporting as the last phase of the deployment, or put it simply as a phase 2, ending the deployment and not having any more time or budget to get reporting. And analytics, as we are evolving into, is the only way that we're going to be able to measure the value and the outcome of a deployment. So we can't leave that for the last phase of the project. Actually has to be the first thing we do. We have to define what outcomes we want to get. How are we going to get them? What data we need to get them? And then let's make sure that we build a plan that's going to allow us to gather that information to make the decisions that we want to make after the deployment is completed.
So with those two things, those are big reasons for deployment. And another great comment that was typed in is another reason for failure is that the software is not very good. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes because there are cases, of course, where that is the case. When we think about deployments and deployment services, and our recommendation to you as enterprises is you have to think about outcome-based deployment. And what is outcome-based deployment? First of all, set up ahead of time what is success. I'll talk about an example of that in a second. Will be measured. Will be measured is not the standard reports that are delivered from the system. What will be measured is not the standard reports delivered with the system. Data is needed, both in the systems and from outside the systems. Who will receive the measures? So who's going to actually get the data to determine whether or not this is successful? How to receive the information? Do they want it in a meeting? Does it delivered to their desktop? Languages do they speak? And when taking out of the transactional, isn't the language, English, Spanish, Hebrew? This is languages that they speak. Do they speak business terms? Do they speak HR terms? Do they speak operational terms? So before you start any deployment, and throughout every deployment, and you'll start deployment methodology at the end of the session here, outcomes need to be stated, they need to be understood, and the whole deployment needs to be towards them. Because if they're not, at the end of the day, your deployment is not going to meet the needs and expectations. Good technology or bad technology. So the poll that's out there right now, do you have specific metrics or outcomes set? You're able to measure after deployment to determine your outcome-based success. So let's you vote here, yes, no, or maybe. Did you have specific measures, metrics, and outcomes set that you were able to measure? So Marisa, where do you think this is going to come in? How do you think the votes are going to come in here?
My guess is going to be wish we did.
Okay.
I think most of us probably realize at the end that we should have done some of these things. Just didn't take the time to do it up front.
Well, you always laugh. I mean, one of the things I joke about, and people don't find it funny, but it's my sense of humor, is that, we go through these implementations, we spend 9 months, we gain 30 pounds, we get divorced, and at the end of the day, we're like, whew, we went live. The go live has been the driver, and one of the things that we want to change is that that's not the driver. It can't be the driver any going forward. So, interesting. We have 45%. Marisa, good job on your prognostication. 40% saying wish they did. 18% saying no, which gives us about 65% saying, have 35% yes. So, it's great that the 35% is yes. It would be interesting to see how many of those are actually business metrics versus HR metrics, and business outcomes versus our outcomes, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So let's move to the next thing. What is success? Okay. The rest of the webinar today, all we're going to talk about is what is success. But for purposes of this slide, what I want to say is success is not live. Okay. In the past, that's how we've seen these tools, is success equals go live. And after that, then we'll think about what's next. Exactly what has killed a lot of organizations' success in delivering metrics, outcomes, and meeting the expectations of the organization. Go live, quote unquote, is one step of the process. But live is not how you measure success. Never will be again. And if that's how you are measuring success, chances of the business actually thinking that you're successful are very, very slim. Marisa, anything to that?
No, I think go live is a measure of a technology going live, a measurement of realization of outcomes and value. So
thanks for adding that.
Yeah, there's many times that people say, we went live, let's see what happens now.
So for those tomato throwers in the audience, once again in your Q&A chat box, type in there whether you agree or disagree, and would love to just see that. So other key measure for success is a new era of processes. And when we think about processes, where we've been in the past is this concept around process optimization. Make a process as efficient and functional as possible. And in HR, we've done a good job at saying, how do we take processes and optimize them? In other cases, we say, how do we actually digitize them? How do we digitize those processes? And a lot of this whole concept of business process re-engineering, quote unquote, we thought was big. What a lot of that was this whole concept of making things as efficient as possible. Big value add is how do we actually transform processes? And transforming processes is saying giving them a different form and a different meaning, those outcomes set up ahead of time. Okay, so I'm not just doing the process to drive efficiency. I'm not just saying, well, we've cut the number of steps from 7 to 5 in the workflow process. I may have done that, but I'm still not driving a business outcome. Process transformation, a key step of every deployment that we do at Knowledge Infusion, is ensuring that we're giving processes a different form, with the outcome being the goal, not eliminating steps, the outcome meaning the goal. The thing that's really interesting when we actually think about, and I love the comment that just came in about your transformation process is not different from business process reengineering. I love that comment, and thank you so much for making it. The goal, though, and what's happened in HR over time, is that the outcomes have HR focused. What we're trying to do is make the outcomes truly tied back into the business strategy and the HR strategy, not just what the technology demands. So every organization does that a little bit differently. I wanted to make sure I answered that question, and I really appreciate you putting it out there. So, a successful business process, and it's successful, what do you mean? It means drives the other side of the equation. The business result beats technology every single time. The best technology in the world with processes, at the end of the day, the grade the technology is going to get is a D to an F. You can have okay technology with great processes. At the end, that technology is going to get a better grade. So very important that everyone understands that. We spend way too much time looking at the technology and not enough time thinking about these other areas. So as the world has changed and as we've moved from an ERP space where we've basically taken everything and customized it to a world now in the software as a service space where that's not as available, or not possible, maybe you can talk about process calibration and why that step of our process is so important.
Absolutely. And I think one thing to know that I think will resonate with everybody is, if we start process information by sitting down and write down what we do today and what steps we can remove from what we do today, we're not transforming. We're maybe or optimizing what we do today. I think one of the biggest issues that we have in how process work is normally. And what we have to do is really start from scratch almost. Think what can the software do, and where do you want to be from an outcome perspective, and where do those two meet? So what we're doing at KI is actually calling that calibration. We used to in the old ERP kind of days think of, okay, how do we change the technology to meet my processes? Today is how do I change and transform process to meet technology? Obviously understanding that there's certain very specific and unique things that we want to do as an organization that the technology may not meet. And that coming together of the technology and the process is what we say here is outcome-based process calibration.
So think about this. A number of different people have put some questions in, and I love the interaction. So thank you guys very much about what are examples. What are examples of outcomes? And one of the things that's really important is those outcomes have to come directly from the business strategy. So I'm a grocery store, and my goal is to add another 300 grocery stores. Another 300 grocery stores, I know I need these types of people. Around my business strategy and my HR strategy then turns into, am I going to hire those people, or am I looking at promoting those people from within? Technology that you're putting in place and the whole deployment should be there to answer the question of how do I know where those people are? How do I know they're ready to move? How do I know who's going to be ready to move to open those 300 stores? Okay, what I've done there in that specific example is I've linked a business strategy to an HR strategy to a deployment. Same thing when it comes to, let me use another example, an organization where my focus is on mergers and acquisitions. And in every merger and acquisition, inside my business strategy, merger acquisition, my HR strategy is to be prepared for mergers and acquisitions and to help the organization optimize where possible, okay, the people that I've acquired. What happens in that situation is if I don't have a talent profile in place to understand what talent I currently have in the organization, I have a technology in place to quickly assess the talent that I've acquired, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for me to help the business make decisions, an outcome-based decision on how I drive who I'm going to need going forward. Okay, so when you think about that, you say, from you, your outcomes, every outcome is going to be different. Say time to fill, it's not quality of hire. That's not your outcome. Your outcome is something that ties directly into the business strategy so that you have the ability then to drive forward and say, see, here's the value I provided. The problem is if you wait until the end of the implementation, so let's say you do the implementation or the deployment, let's get it in as quickly as possible. Likely, the way you did the deployment missed out on configuring the software and configuring the technology to do what you needed to do from a business standpoint, and to go back and change that after is very, very hard. So, those are a couple examples of outcomes. Once again, you can spend all day going through these outcomes, but understand they're not outcomes that are the same for every organization. They're going to be different, which is directly into this next section, what are the organizational capabilities needed? And once again, if we look at this tree, and I'll call these out, but I'm going to go into a little more detail in the next slide. User experience, strategy, make sure I understand strategy, governance, process, analytical storytelling. Look at those things, all those capabilities. When I try to drive those together, I get into really looking at these sets of organizational capabilities. So governance, how are decisions being made? And when there are decisions that aren't done at the IT level, these are decisions that aren't done at the HR transactional level. These are decisions that are being made as you're thinking about deployment, as you start to plan the deployment, and during the deployment that says, are we going to meet the outcomes? Keeping the outcomes front and center throughout. Design, people that truly understand how to transform processes. And again, not to make the process more efficient. Realize that most HR processes today don't involve employees. And every HR process should involve employees interacting. What it means is a complete transformation and redesign, and who owns those processes. I understand the business and HR strategy and the functional expertise on that. I have marketing as part of my HR function. Okay, HR people to use technology in the past, that's been their job. To get employees to use workforce technology, to change that, go forward, require marketing and adoption. I need people to understand user experience. And once experience, not something that just looks cool and sexy, but actually we actually use user experience to understand how do people get things done, and how do they make decisions. And be able to tell stories. I need to understand data and stories that tie back to those outcomes. So by doing this deployment, I was able to help my grocery store CEO. She's going to have the people needed to open those locations. Okay, so organizational capabilities are really, really important, and we're going to talk a little more about this in a second. Marisa, anything that I skimmed over there that you want to jump in with?
I'd like to just summarize that the role of HR is changing. Look at this list. Some of these things may have been things that HR always did, like understand HR strategy, marketing, experience. Those are traditionally things that it has taken on. And implementations and deployments evolve. And as the software evolves, these are things that now HR has to have to make deployment successful and to get the value out of their systems to make decisions that they need to make.
Interesting question for everyone on the line. For those of you who are doing deployments or planning deployments, how many of you have this capability? Just say yes, I've got all of this capability in my HR organization today, or no, I don't. And once again, I'll just watch the yeses and nos come in and try to do sort of a straw poll here to see, how that's coming, how that's looking. So in your Q&A box, just type in yes or no, because I'd love to see where this falls. One of the questions that just came in, I'm going to get to it because it's important, is this concept of user experience. What does that mean? A lot of people ask what that means. The example that I always tie that back to is if you think about, ever bought a book on Amazon.com? And when you think about Amazon.com, when you actually look at Amazon.com and you go to buy a book, it also tells you in real time other people that have bought that book, what they've bought. What they've bought. Okay. So when I say that, I've created a user experience that's combining a transaction, which is a book, and an analytic, is more information right in that same screen. So most people have done that. Now, if I tie that to an HR example, when we're doing a transaction, MA designing my processes where an analytic shows me right at the moment what that means. in most cases, the answer is no. We haven't done that. We haven't created that user experience. I asked you the question, how many of you would log into an analytics tool, then to type in the book and say, for this it's this, for this it's this, for this it's this. If I bought this book, others bought this. Most of you wouldn't take the time to log in and understand that. But putting it right in their face and designing a user experience that makes sense, that's what drives that process. So that's where we start talking about user experience. How do we make sure that the users have what they need to use the system to drive the outcomes? The person that didn't understand my question, I apologize. My question was, do you have the capability internally in HR to know these capabilities listed on the slide? Continue on and talk about sort of IT and the IT area, how organizations going forward are going to have a lesser dependence on IT. And to do that, what's important for everyone in HR to understand is how the role of IT is changing. The role of IT in most organizations is not to have a bunch of developers around. The role in most organizations is not to have a bunch of IT organizations is not to have report writers sitting around. The IT going forward is a changed role, which is how do I actually create specific technologies and enable specific processes to drive competitive advantage. So I'm a grocery store, once again, the point of sale system or the reward system. Manufacturer, what kind of technology am I using that's not shelf, but I'm building myself to actually drive my assembly line. So the role of CIOs and IT is changing from a support function to a business driver function, but that driver function is not to support off-the-shelf software any longer. It's to support true competitive uniquenesses. To have enterprise architecture, understanding of where the connectors are, understanding of the portal and how to automate the concepts of the portal, understanding of business intelligence, and understanding all of these other workforce-facing solutions. So what that means is, going forward, people that have been in the HR and HRIS role going forward would be great if we could move them into HR, because a lot of that's going to be needed. Start to think that they're going to continue to get the support of the function going forward to write reports, configure and customize systems, database tune, et cetera, if realistic based on the economy that we're living in today. And once again, not blaming the economy, that's a changed role of IT and a new world we're living in. Marisa, do you think to that?
Yeah, I think that the one thing to add is data. We'll have now the time to actually focus on understanding the data, which has been a role all along, but has always been split between understanding the data as well as having to do customizations and development. Well, now we actually are going to have the time to understand the meaning of the data, to then be able to develop those connectors or integrations that the true value to all of the different parts of the system. Also support business intelligence. If you don't understand what the data means or what the combination of the different data elements from the different systems mean, then you can't really support business intelligence correctly. So I think it's a great thing, actually, that it frees up time on the IT side to focus on understanding the meaning of the data.
Great. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Keep that stuff in mind. There's a question that I want to read that came in, and once again, please type in your questions in the Q&A box because I want to make sure that we keep those coming in. Could the IT guys be thinking that they need to know a lot more, just like HR guys? Should we assume IT's roles and capabilities are more constrained than HR's? It's a great point. I mean, IT. I think that what we have to do is we have to make that HR doesn't depend too much on IT, and HR doesn't just say, technology is not my concern. Technology is HR's concern today. IT is there to support it, not to solve the decisions and drive it. The question that came in that I want to get to is, sometimes a system makes it harder for the average employee compared to a paper system, but much more useful to leadership. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe one of the things you can do is put a link to the blog I write daily on here, because I've written about this many times, and everyone can read it. But what's important to understand here is that comment itself starts to drive change, and it starts to drive this new target audience. So for the person who asked the question, it's a perfect lead-in to this next thing. In many cases, systems, if they're not deployed correctly and not branded correctly, make it harder than paper, but much useful to leadership. So when we think of that, how do we market, how do we brand, and how do we deploy with it around that? Thanks you, Blake, for putting up the blog up there. That's helpful. So about the target audience, what do we think about? Think about the workforce first and the function next. So in the past, HR technology has been used by 1%, 19% HR. Going forward, HR technology is going to be used by 99% workforce, 1% HR. And that's a huge, huge difference. And it's very important to think about as you think about marketing, branding, usability, user experience. The value of the deployment is driven by the workforce. If the workforce doesn't buy into it, deployment will have zero value or very little value. I use this example of LinkedIn. Did LinkedIn create a ton of value, or did all the people that use LinkedIn create the value? The demographic of the workforce. Our workforce from a technology standpoint. We have people, we have customers that we work with during deployment that disregard the fact that people have technology at home, the fact that they use their smartphones for everything, and they still people would never use the technology. If and branded and purposes that make sense to the employees in place, any technographic part of the workforce will use the technology. Ability. People are traveling everywhere. People are moving everywhere. How do I keep in mind that I have access to these systems from home? I know there's rules, I know there's regulations, we know there's unions, et cetera, but how do I market and brand to those things? And lastly, globability, or global aspects of the workforce. Any deployment that's phase 1 is U.S., phase 2 is global, is food when it's to truly driving value. Our recommendation would be to rethink how you phase your deployments and say, what is the first phase? How is phase 1 going to get me some outcome value? And so phase 1 is going to be this, phase 2 is going to be this, phase 3 is going to be this, phase 4 is going to be this, and at the end of phase 4, then I'll actually start to see the value. More than likely, business is going to change, the fund's going to change, the strategy is going to change. You're going to find yourself, if you get done with the deployment, it doesn't match the strategy anymore. Marisa, you want to add to that?
No, you covered it all, Jason.
Okay, great. As we get into the messaging and branding, that ties back into who are we messaging and branding to. So the WIIFM, what's in it for me? What's in it for me has to be workforce, not the department. So who are buyers? Who people that you have to impress and get to the system? What's important? Why should I? One of the things we've had to do at Knowledge Infusion is we've had to, basically partner. Well, excuse me, not basically. We have partnered with major creative firms to help build logos, to help build flash presentations, to help develop T-shirts, to help develop posters, to help develop, cool brands. All this to make sure people use it, which is why continual marketing and messaging is paramount. It's not go live once we're done. It has to be continual. It has to be aligned to the business strategy. So the reason I'm doing my deployment is to help us open 300 grocery stores later on. And I have focused on engagement. And when I say engagement, that's not employee engagement. If the employees are engaged with the technology, they're used frequently, they're go frequently, they depend on it, it's proven, and it becomes a part of their job. So they're engaged with the technology, not making their job, or not that they're becoming more engaged. So question for you, in any sort of HR and technology deployment, have you encountered resistance in deploying software because you haven't clearly defined the benefits to the end user? So I would love to get your thoughts on this. This is one of the, once again, the biggest mistakes we see organizations make with deploying technology today. They haven't.
I think one clarifying thing there for the question, Jason, is I get many times where the business case is built upon building efficiencies for HR. So we'll be able to reduce manual data entry. We'll be able to produce reports faster. We're going to be able to run people faster, et cetera. And that doesn't make the case anymore for why to make the expenditure on an HR deployment. There's got to be value to the business and the end user.
When we take a look at this, we have 75% of the people on the call, the 150 on the call, saying, that they've run into this either in every deployment or yes, they have. 20% saying no. And that, once again, just an overwhelming number, which is why deployment. We're going to change the industry here and get people to stop using the term implementation. Implementation, a technical term. Deployment is more than just the implementation. There's much more branding and things like that, the actual technology implementation. We have some time. We don't have time, but there's a question that came in I just love, and Marisa, do you see it? So, be aware that software as a service vendors have a conflict of interest with your implementation deployment. Their priority is get you deployed as soon as possible so they can start collecting their monthly, quarterly fees. They have a vested interest in the outcome. So, I'm speechless at the question because I do this every single day of my life, and I never actually heard someone write the question so succinctly. So what your question is there is exactly what we're trying to do. Trying to say that 30 to 40% of your deployment and implementation is done before you ever sign a software contract. Okay? Our methodology is built in a way to do that. So before you sign a contract, and I realize it doesn't do any good if you've already signed a contract, but before you sign a contract, you've already done your process work. You've already done your governance work. You've already set up what your phased rollouts are going to be. You already know the configuration and the calibrations that you're going to have to make so that as you get into working with the software as a service vendor, you're not making the 80% of the decisions, which are people and process decisions. You're making just the technology and the configuration decisions so that they can get you live as quickly as possible. The thing that slows down deployments that is the conflict of interest SaaS vendors is when organizations don't have all of their ducks in a row internally or don't even know what to ask. If the software as a service vendor is going to solve all of these process issues, branding issues, marketing issues, governance issues, executive buy-in issues, because the technology, excuse me for the technologists on the phone, but the technology is the dumb part of this. The process and the people work, the 80 to 90% of it, that actually has to be done before you actually start getting into that SaaS model, which is different. It's completely different than the past, and it takes a completely different mindset for anyone in this space. Marisa, if you want to add anything to that.
No, that is perfect. And I actually think that one of the things that software vendors hate, and when the deployment starts and they start having workshops to discuss configuration, it's a realization that decisions haven't been made. And this analysis paralysis going on where the vendor's ready with their worksheets to be filed and the organization can't give them the information.
Yeah, no, great point. So before we get to budget, there's a couple more questions I want to get to. And by the way, that question, I didn't mean to embarrass the person that asked it. That question is exactly why Knowledge Infusion has moved from strategy as a strategy-based consultancy into an organization that provides strategy and now full-service deployment. Because we're finding that what was needed in the strategy work was actually getting organizations ready for the deployment And you can't just have a strategy and then hand it off to someone else to do the implementation without including and blending those two phases together. You cannot do it. The culture, the internal politics within the organization, why are you doing it, what are the outcomes. There's too many connections between strategy and deployment to just hand off once you've selected the vendor to someone to do the technical implementation. The question that came in says, we have also received resistance to deployment by leadership who's not on the same page as benefits. It's a great point, and the way that I'll address that point is that in many cases that goes back to that language speaking issue. We see that the benefits are benefits that we're not speaking true business language, meaning by doing this we're going to be able to drive higher profit margin. By doing this we're going to be able to open stores more quickly. By doing this our patient satisfaction rate is going to go up. Whatever those things are, the resistance to deployment by leadership is almost always tied to the concept that the way it's being marketed and positioned is not what's in it for me from a business person standpoint. It's HR pushing out a policy and trying to drive that forward. Another question, biggest issue we've received is from the management team. There's real issue with transparency. And that, once again, great comment. That is a change and culture issue, which again, technology will never solve. So once again, when you look at the deployment work we do and the sort of audience assessment tying back into management, let's say I'm deploying talent profiles, and I want every management team member to be able to do a search for talent because I've been grooming my own talent for a long time, and I don't want poaching to go on between team members. For the person that asked that question, I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about, but reading between the lines, maybe it is. When you think about that, it's a cultural issue, and that's something that has to come from the top, and it's part of your deployment. That is part of your deployment. It's nothing that IT is ever going to be able to drive. So once again, when people say we put the technology in and it didn't do what we expected, to open that transparency and to have managers sharing talent, guess the technology is never going to do that unless that people and process work is done up front and the technology is configured to that work. If you configure the technology and hope you're going to work backwards to the things, that's where the technology fails. So continue on a second. So as we move forward, this whole concept of building in a budget for deployment, as we think about building budget, what are those things? First of all, a pilot. And when we think about a pilot, a lot of organizations say we don't need a pilot, quote unquote. Pilots are really important because they drive overall testing. Okay? They drive overall testing. And once again, not the testing that you're used to from a technology standpoint, but testing of the question that someone just asked. To have that transparency. Is going to accept it? Is the messaging working? Is the user experience working? Am I putting out too many different signals, et cetera, et cetera? So piloting and creating a group of champions. You're budgeting for both program and project management, the management of the technology, but also the management of the whole program, whether it be an HR transformation or whether it be a talent management type deployment. Make sure that you're budgeting for transformation, and you don't think that's included in the quote-unquote vendor's quote. You're putting the money in there for marketing and branding. Okay, putting the money in there for marketing and branding. You're putting it in there for governance. You're putting it in there for outcome definition and tying back to strategy. You're putting there configuration. And when I say configuration, that configuration is also that calibration phase. Calibration is going to be, guys, we have 9 decisions to make here. That we are either going to customize the software, which isn't possible in many cases, or we're going to have to calibrate, and this is our new process. That takes time and money from the standpoint of resources to those things going forward. once getting the overall message, and again, launch and optimization. And a great point that one of the persons just sent to me, just money, but the time. And when I talk about when I talk about money, I'm talking about time, but that's very, very important. It's an important clarification, and thank you for making it. These things take time. When the software vendors come in and say you can be live in 6 weeks or you can be live in 12 weeks, guess what? You can. Live on Facebook in 1 day. You can on LinkedIn in a minute. Are you seeing the value of it? Are you thinking through all of the things? Are you understanding all of the capabilities? And once again, those are weird examples. I get it. Understand the technology is the easy part. You can be on any technology in a very short period of time today. When it comes to these other issues, that takes the time, and that's where the money comes into play. Anything to that?
I think the main thing is that, like we said before, some of these activities happen before the actual technology deployment begins.
Yep.
So you have to think of the deployment project as a lot more than just the technology piece, and that will help you create the program plan and the budget versus thinking of, okay, day one is when the vendor shows up. That already is going to cut you short in time.
Great, thank you for adding that. So we look at this new path, and once again, Marisa, did a couple of the boxes not show up on your slides?
They show up on mine.
Oh, how odd. So I have 2 white boxes. So when you start at the first phase, define and align. What are you doing? Taking your strategy, making sure that we're aligning it with the project you're about to do, and getting the governance is in place. Second, transform and integrate. How do I transform my processes? How do I make sure that I have my integrations in the right place at the right time? Third, adopt and engage. How do I make sure that I'm putting that user testing in place, user experience testing in place? For that one that said they have 2 white boxes too, thank you. I thought I might have been losing my mind for a second. And lastly, business intelligence and analytics. How do we make sure those outcomes are there? And how do we make sure this is a complete circle? Nice drawing by me, always. And it's not just something we go down the path and say, oh, we're live, we're done. We always have to be adopting and adjusting. So when we look at our approach, it starts with what's strategy? What's the outcomes? What are the outcomes? What are we trying to do? Then into governance. Is the governance process in place? Then get into technology. Once again, this is up here, this area that the deployment strategy and governance, this is 30 to 40% of the implementation that should be done before you start touching the technology. Technology. How to transform and configure processes? How do I do integration? How do I come up with my testing? And then how to launch and measure around management, marketing, branding. If you look at those things and you look at the outside of this box, change management and program management are fluid. They're constant and they're continual. So it isn't a phase that's just inserted right here. Change starts the day or even before the day you start to do this project. And that's very, very important to consider as you're going through. So, from Infusion's standpoint, those are the areas that we work with organizations to develop full service approaches around taking your strategy, looking at the outcomes, and building a deployment plan, the aspect of that deployment plan that matches that going forward. A lot, and we've taken a lot of questions throughout, and there's some more questions that we haven't gotten to. So for those online, please type in some questions, and we're going to get to some really interesting ones, I think, here in a second. We have a few minutes. But for those that sign off, which some people always do, thank you very much for joining, and Marisa, thank you very much for presenting with me here as well today.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everybody.
And I'm going to put up some contact information here as well so that you have it. And once again, please write questions. Please email if you think Knowledge Infusion can help you with some of these things. Please drop an email, and happy to respond to you via email and just give some advice. Question: when going to a parent company's system, what are the questions we should ask up front? Thank you for that question. What's really important to understand, and this is a long question that definitely that we can answer on this call now, but understanding organizational structures are really, really important. Understanding the data that's being tracked by the parent company's system, understanding the capabilities of that parent company system, and understanding where those gaps are. So again, in many cases when we work with organizations to do this, we'll find that the company, the child company, has some systems in place that actually could help the parent company because they're more agile, but the company hasn't had a chance to think about how to do those yet, or the child company hasn't had a chance to paint the value yet. So when you think about that, the question should be, A, what's the parent company doing? What's the org structure, and are the org structures going to match, and what am I going to have to change? B, what's the data that's being collected by the parent company, and do I collect data internally that I need that might not be collected by them? And then C, what are the systems I have in place that actually still might be the uniquenesses and competitive advantages I have in my child company that the parent company system's not going to meet? Hope that question's helpful. And for the person that asked, please let me know or send me an email. Another question, or statement question regarding business outcomes. Many investments are deployed. Many investments are deployed when lots of other things are going on in the company. How do you know it's the investment driving the business outcome or the other stuff? And that's a great question. The answer to the question is that all of this is directional. We can get to the point where we can measure. But when we get down to the point where we're having to prove burden of proof without a reasonable doubt, that's when we know we've taken this a bit too far. So, once again, we're showing alignment. We're showing up to the table, quote unquote, with data. We're showing up to the party with information. If we're doing that, we're going to be seen as HR as a true business partner and helping to drive that. We're going to show up at the table and say, because of this deployment, we changed the business. This would never even let us do that. Showing up with data that's aligned, we are going to be painted as part of that success, and from a HR credibility standpoint, we're going to get what we want and continue what we want going forward. There's one more question here I want to get to, and I lost it. All right. So the concept around specific technical capabilities and how do we assess vendors. Assessing vendors is very, very interesting in the space today. And one of the things that we've done as Knowledge Infusion is switched from help organizations do vendor selections where I'm sending out RFPs to 10 vendors to actually saying, based on what you're trying to do and the outcomes you're trying to achieve, here are the few vendors that sense to you, and making a recommendation as to which vendors you should work with. Once again, in a space that's consolidated, in a space that's changed drastically, in a space where you don't get second chances, where you can't pick a technology, hope it works, and then go back to the later and say, oh, let's try again. We've moved from that selection approach to that recommendation approach. And once again, very easily by understanding the outcomes you're trying to achieve, understanding the type of organization you are and what you're trying to do, that's how you actually get to a technology selection. Many of these vendors, if you do RFPs and checklists, you'll find that they're commodities. What really makes the difference is vendors that have proven themselves, vendors that we've seen be successful in the space, and vendors that we can say they're committed to the long term. They're not just committed to let's get them live and get out. That's, the way we're choosing vendors in the space today is changing just as rapidly as the way we deploy. So, a lot of information. Marisa, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that I enjoyed doing the webinar and really appreciate all of your help in answering the questions that came in today.
No problem. Thank you.
For those of you that joined, thank you for the time. Please reach out with questions, comments, arguments. Throw it to me. Feel free to do it in email if you don't want to do it directly, because I'd love to continue to have these conversations. And then, Blake, I'll turn it over to you as to how to get more information about any of these Knowledge Infusion services and follow up from here. Thanks, Blake.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Jason and Marisa, very much. And thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. Just a quick reminder that the material covered in today's presentation, including both the slides and the replay link, will be emailed to you. Also, please take a minute to fill out the post-event survey just to let us know how we did and so we can better understand your challenges and where Knowledge Infusion can support you throughout 2011 and beyond. And as Jason mentioned, you are more than welcome to email him and Marisa directly for more information around this topic. You can also follow Jason on Twitter, and a great resource for everyone is the Knowledge Infuser blog. So be sure to check it out. From insight from Jason on other critical topics crucial to successful deployment in 2011. And you can always find out more about our services at www.knowledgeinfusion.com. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.